Jomo Kenyatta was, or is viewed as Kenya's father of independence, so to speak. He was part, or was drafted into some of the pre-independence political movements at the time, and was sent to the United Kingdom to plead Kenya's case. He stayed there for a number of years, comes back, reinvented as Jomo Kenyatta. He used to go by the name Johnston Kamau. And at that point in time, he starts to get a much bigger role in the pre-independence struggle. He gets arrested, detained, and while he's in there, the mystique and a lot of the push for independence also went alongside a push for him to be released. In fact, the father of the current former Prime Minister, Raila Odinga, his father, Jaramogi Odinga, refused to ascend to power until Jomo Kenyatta was released. So Jomo Kenyatta is a very big big and very significant historical figure in Kenya. And of course, he was the first Prime Minister and later on first President of the Republic.
Oh, that's interesting. So he was the reason why he was in the UK, because he married an Englishwoman as well, didn't he?
Yes.
Was because he was sent there by the Kenyans in order to kind of make the case for independence.
Yes, that's exactly why he was sent. He used to be a water meter reader in I think the colonial government's municipal council. He also edited a Kikuyu language magazine, was an author, a failed actor. He had many careers, right? But when it came to that pre-independence period, he was also fairly well spoken. I believe that's part of the reason why he was selected from amongst the political intelligentsia at the time to go up there and plead his case. In fact, a couple of pictures of him speaking. Where is this place in London with the big lions and the fountain? Some place where you guys do a lot of political gathering. Yes, yes. Yeah, so there are a couple of pictures of him doing that, and yeah, so essentially he was an important cog. Whether he did what he was sent to do is another question, but yeah, here we are.
Because it's kind of strange that, for all I have known about Kenyatta is that he was this figure in the independence of Kenya, and then at the point where Kenya became independent, essentially he made peace with Britain, but
yeah, which is completely, it's just one of those things in history that really boggles the mind, because Jomo Kenyatta was not an active leader of the Mau Mau or the Kenya Land Defense Force, which is their official title. He wasn't even engaged with them. In fact, he was a moderate. He pleaded for peace and he was very anti guerrilla movement, right? But I guess through association, through his political popularity, and that mystique around him, then the British here, the settlers, started to associate him with the Mau Mau movement and that insurgency. But in fact, he wasn't really a central figure in the pre-independence war that Kenya fought, from 1952 up all the way until maybe about 1957. So his imprisonment and all of that was really more of like a white fear thing of who Kenyatta was, etc. The real leaders of the independence struggle, the real leaders were people like Bildad Kagia, who wound up in Lokitang with Jomo Kenyatta imprisoned with him. And they were revolutionaries until they died. Jomo Kenyatta, there seemed to have been some rapprochement between Jomo Kenyatta and the colonial government in the late 50s to early 60s, because he then gets transferred out of the real prison system that was set up to deal with the Mau Mau, and was housed in a place in Samburu, which is in sort of like not central Kenya, central to northern Kenya. And it was like a nice maisonette and everything. In fact, that's where our current president was conceived, because then, his wife would go up to them. So there was some rapprochement at some point. But the British thought of him as, what did they call him? A leader unto death and darkness, which really wasn't who he was. At least not any Kenyan's reading of who he was.
What was revealed about Kenyatta's offshore wealth in the Pandora Papers?
Okay, so it was more a revelation of the family's wealth as opposed to Uhuru Kenyatta's personal wealth. And what was revealed is that the family had invested in offshore structures for, if you're including the extended family, as early as the mid-70s, right before Jomo Kenyatta passes. But they started to invest in earnest, at least from what the Pandora Papers show, in the early 2000s. Now, this is an important time because Kenya was going through a transition and Uhuru Kenyatta was on the ballot for the first time. The first, trusts and foundations that we saw were registered on or around May of 2003, which was immediately after he lost in the race for the presidency. Then you see a bit of an uptick in 2007 again, which is another 2007-2008, which is another electoral period. But this time mostly by his sisters and his mother. And then later on, there's his brother, Jomo Kenyatta, who's seen to be the holder or the administrator of the family's wealth. Uhuru Kenyatta was listed as a beneficiary of a trust, essentially that, so to speak, belonged to his mother upon her death. So that's the only bit of evidence that we had linking Uhuru Kenyatta directly to a trust or a foundation. But the family is very well invested in trusts and foundations.
Was that the first time that people became aware, the Pandora Papers, that people became aware of how wealthy the Kenyattas were and that they were making use of offshore structures, or were they already a well-known wealthy family in Kenya?
So the Kenyattas have been a well-known wealthy family since the 60s, since Jomo Kenyatta assumed power. I think what's been more of an open question is the source of their wealth, which seems to be tied a lot to very many legitimate businesses in tourism, in agriculture, in banking. They're really all over the shop when it comes to the kinds of investments that they have in Kenya and beyond. Why I talk about the source of their wealth is because there's always been an open question about how Jomo Kenyatta was able to become such a rich person. Just 1 or 2 years after becoming president, after ascending to the presidency. His salary at the time doesn't match the kind of wealth that he has. There have been memoirs written by people from his administration that say that he essentially would engage in land grabs of very, very prime pieces of land owned by either members of the settler community, etc. And the Kenyatta family have vast investments in land across the country, right down to the coast, all the way up to the what was called the White Highlands in pre-colonial times. So that's always been established. What they have done is they've also invested, like I said, in various legitimate industries. They own the biggest milk factory, the biggest milk company in Kenya. They own one of Kenya's biggest banks. They have a chain of hotels that are fairly well-to-do. They're building a sub-city right now, just right outside the bounds of Nairobi city. And they seem to have this kind of wealth that could last them generations if they wanted it to. In terms of offshore investments, that was more of a rumor, right? So nobody had really ever said that the Kenyattas invest in offshore structures before the Pandora Papers. But it had always been rumored that, given that they have various interests and investments and relationships outside the country, that it's more than likely that they would have invested in the same.
So how was this news of the kind of offshore wealth received in Kenya when it came to light?
The reactions were mixed. So in the 24 hours after the October 3rd, when the documentary was published and all of this news came out as the Pandora Papers leak was made public, The reaction from the Kenyan press was rather muted. There was no follow-up, there was no reporting until, I'd say, October the 4th, October the 5th, when Uhuru Kenyatta makes this statement about him welcoming the findings of the Pandora Papers, thinking that it's going to lead to better accountability and openness in the global finance system. That's when you start to see an uptick in the reporting around specifically the Kenyattas' involvement in the Pandora Papers and the Pandora Papers in general. But even then, what you found was, I'd say, somewhat of a pedantic effort to explain that offshore finance structures are not necessarily illegal. They're not immoral. They're instruments that are used by businesses all over the world, which is true, right? But the question, the central question that was being asked in that documentary wasn't so much that it was illegal. In fact, there's nothing to show that any of the funds or the proceeds that were found in those structures was illegal. The question is, why would a family that has such deep roots in Kenya, that is engaged in its leadership, both politically and in business, be so invested in offshore finance structures that have also been used by the world's criminal elite? And I think when Uhuru Kenyatta made his response, it kind of pointed indirectly to the fact that he knows that offshore finance has often been a sink for all sorts of shadowy financing, for terrorism, for illicit financial flows, and that. So why the involvement? But I don't think many people outrightly chose or elected to try and ask in their reporting after that about that. And in fact, because he was in the midst of a bit of a political divorce between him and his deputy president, some of the shade that was thrown at my reporting was that it was funded or sponsored by the deputy president to kind of, have people diverted from the fact that he's also, incredibly corrupt, so goes the claim, right? But, it just felt, I don't think to this day it has received the kind of attention that it should.